Atif, I want to add that your view of taxing wealth is a great one. There's a simple way to do it. We could have some inflation. Now in Europe, I know this goes against the Bundesbank view, and I know you're very familiar, all of you familiar with Bernanke's previous papers talking about Japan advocating higher rates of inflation. So the question is, I mean, we can understand why in Europe this has been a long-standing antipathy towards inflation, but the fact that that Bernanke has now been captured by that view, and as Professor Bernanke, he was arguing against it very severely, is I think, an interesting topic. And
yeah. Can I say something on it?
Of course, please.
So I completely agree with you, and in fact, you know, that's when Bernanke had those famous words of dropping money via helicopters in Japan, but we are not doing that in the US.
No.
My view on inflation is, and I guess this would be the defense that Bernanke would have probably if one could ask him openly this question. Inflation is not something that is in our control necessarily, and that is because of the way we have Fed independence. So really, to have inflation in this kind of a situation, you literally need helicopter drops. You need to monetize fiscal. So that was the other side of how to raise revenue, and I think that's your point basically. If we can't do it through wealth or don't want to do it, the other is to just monetize it directly. That's again very unorthodox, right? But that also is an implication that will come out of this kind of an analysis. You simply spend and you monetize it. This is basically saying you print money and you literally, you know, you're just giving dollars away.
Well, at least it would help to have a commitment, explicit commitment to say 4%
now,
rather than 2%, and say we're going to do it as long as it needs
exactly.
to be done.
But doing it that way is illegal today. So you'll have to pass the law first.
How is it illegal?
Because the Fed can only buy something of the same collateral and then it can print money against it.
No, my understanding is they can do explicit targets.
Under the third tree amendment, the Fed can buy any asset it wants.
But they have to buy
under exigent circumstances, the Fed could buy the desks in the bank and pay for the.
They could buy something which is worthless and give $1 billion.
Absolutely.
Okay, if they can do it, then fine. But yeah. So that's what's needed to be done. Yeah.
Yeah. Bill, please start.
I thought that the county data was absolutely fascinating, and the pattern is remarkable. But I have to say, when you put up how to spend it, I thought what you were going to propose was a county-specific WPA, which sounds to me like the most remarkably direct way to get cash into the hands of the people who can't meet their debts without having to worry about, believe me, I know that is not politically feasible either. But once upon a time, that was a way of dealing with very specific local depressions that would have a very immediate impact on consumption.
That's exactly what I'm saying, actually. But I'm being even more focused than that. If you focus on debt reduction, even within the high-level counties, you're focusing exactly on the people who are in trouble. But that's basically what we want.
Could I make a comment about that, too? I like 95% of what Atif had to say, but I have a little bit of a problem with, I don't have a problem with your particular proposal. I think it's very interesting. I work in something in St. Louis called the Murray Wiedenbaum Center on the Government Economy and Public Policy, and Murray Wiedenbaum has been talking about consumption taxes for years, and it's interesting you're talking about actually taxing saving, and I've thought about that too. And so it's a little unorthodox, but it makes sense in this context. But the broader point I wanted to make is, I'm not so sure why we're worried about this redistribution in some respects. If you take the kinds of analysis I was throwing out there, the positive effects, this is the net social gain. This is not a pure redistribution. There's a net social gain from the kinds of policies we're talking about. I don't think we have to worry about, well, from an economic point of view, we don't have to worry about the redistribution. I think the vast majority of people will be made better off by these policies. Now, maybe politically, it would be more feasible. The political economy I would take seriously. If we can't do a more standard fiscal expansion, then maybe this is the second best.
Atif, two questions. One short question is about indigeneity of low leverage and high leverage counties. They probably differ in other respects as well. Maybe the leverage is endogenous to some other characteristic, the structure of labor force, skills, and so on. And so maybe you need somehow to instrument for both the employment numbers and for leverage numbers somehow. I'm sure you've done that in some of the papers, but it would be interesting to hear what is different between those counties as well. The other one is, what do you think about the other way to fight zero lower bound? For example, committing to an increasing consumption tax, making sure that prices will actually go up, and also pushing people to spend now rather than in the future, and also raising some cash for the budget.
So on the first issue, yeah, you're exactly right. I'm basically an empiricist, and that's I would die if I don't answer that question. The answer is that you can, so one instrument is in the US is land topology, which is the reason for the boom in this case was just this push of capital from outside into the US, which was there everywhere, but it translated into house prices differentially depending on the topology of the area. So the areas which had more inelastic housing supply because they were constrained in how much you can build. So like the Bay Area where you have more mountains and so on. I agree, it doesn't explain Las Vegas. No one can explain Las Vegas. but most of the US on average, you get a very strong first stage from this instrument. So that's just giving you one idea. But then we also do a much more careful job of making sure that we are looking at areas. I'll give you one example on the employment, which I find fascinating. We can focus on just one to show you how strong this result is. Just focus on the auto sector. Okay, the nice thing about the auto sector is within the auto sector, you have both the tradable component and the non-tradable component. The tradable component is the manufacturing that sits in line of Alabama and Detroit and so on. And the non-trading are the dealerships that have to be present everywhere. Okay? Now you rank these counties by the same measure, and you plot the manufacturing, those are sub-auto parts as well and all that. You plot the drop in employment on the tradable and the non-tradable, two separate graphs against the same leverage ranking. The tradable component, you see a flat, it's obviously dropping, but you see a flat line. The non-tradable, you exactly see the same pattern, right? Because the dealerships have no customers in exactly those areas, right? So that's a much cleaner test of that. So the short answer is, and the papers are out there, so you can look at the rest. Your second question on the timing of consumption tax. So this is, I think, Emmanuel Fari and others, they have this paper. I think it conceptually kind of works. My concern with this kind of stuff is that you know exactly where the problem is. So this is like taking a much bigger hammer to do fine painting, right? So yeah, it conceptually can work, but you need a bunch of things. You need commitment to raise consumption taxes in the future, and exactly how long a future, 3 years, is the next president going to obey our commitments? I mean, I don't know, there's just too much there. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of the practicality of such proposals. But yeah, they are conceptually trying to do the right thing. That I agree with.
I had a question for Giancarlo on the DeLong and Summers paper, and in particular, the argument that under special circumstances, such as happen to apply right now in the United States, not only is there a substantial multiplier, but that the debt-financed fiscal stimulus would literally pay for itself on a cash-on-cash basis. And the extent to which your data, the framework and the data you have, could be used to perhaps test that more generally or put that finding or that assertion into a broader context.
Empirically, I'm not sure. I haven't done the homework completely. Empirically, I don't think we can use, I mean, also like, I don't know whether maybe with the threshold we are, but even his calculation would not provide a self-financing multiplier there. So I don't know. And in principle, it's a question that cannot really be answered with this time series study. But maybe a way to answer this question is also a way to address the question on the consumption tax multiplier. we are trying to understand a little better the economics of the liquidity trap. Now, we are in a liquidity trap and a financial crisis. Now, all these ideas of stimulating consumption today by changing the price of consumption across time works in certain models, it doesn't work in others. And I thought that one of the good news about these new papers by Brad and Larry, but also, again, Pontus does the homework of the theory, is that you start to understand other ways in which you don't need, for example, Calvo pricing, staggered pricing, which, you know, may be, you know, perhaps a little bit of downward nominal rigidity in wages. That's all you need, more than specific ways in which price decisions are staggered. So, like, it is, I'm a little bit reluctant on underwriting this intertemporal intervention. In the UK, actually, the VIT trial, the idea has been done, and it runs immediately into this issue that then you need to raise it, and you feel like you should not raise it. And it didn't do much in the first place. So there is actually this idea of stimulating consumption through intertemporal, stimulating investment intertemporal, I think needs to be digested more, looking better into this hysteresis issue, this financial market crisis, which is still not well, I would say the word model, but really understood at this stage, what exactly means.
Yes.
First, just a comment. Fleming and the late Robert Mundell, of course, famously argued years ago that in a regime of freely floating currencies, that stimulus and Keynesian multipliers wouldn't apply. But we're at a strange historical moment when the key currency relationship between the Chinese and American currency is fixed by the Chinese government, and the euro is in such deep trouble that it doesn't seem to hold much promise for appreciation. Plus, the American market is the only one deep enough to take the risk-off trades in the currencies. So it may be that the Fleming-Mundell constraint doesn't begin to apply in these strange circumstances. But more significantly, of course, what occurred was not simply a cyclical event, in which case one could have argued that, well, the Friedman-Schwartz analysis may still apply, even though it was a deep event. But it was a structural event in two senses. One, that the banking system collapsed, but secondly, that we went from a spending economy, an economy that saved -1% because it was drawing money out of housing mortgages, to an economy that very quickly went to saving 3 to 4%, and maybe on its way to saving the 7% that was traditional in the 1950s. And that was such a blow to demand that that alone, I think, would have called for a fiscal response. Finally, there's a strong argument to be made for a fiscal response, even if there's no multiplier, simply by asking the question, when is the best time to repair the rotting infrastructure and do all the other things that need to be done, when the private sector has to compete with, when the government has to compete with the private sector for physical inputs, for labor, and for capital, or when all of those are easily available. Moreover, one has, of course, finally to consider the non-economic consequences of long-term unemployment, and there are plenty of studies that show how it leads to family dissolution, alcoholism, drug abuse, and so on. So on all of these grounds, it seems as if a strong fiscal stimulus, stronger than what we had, was required.
So that really wasn't a question, but I'll respond anyway. The case is overwhelming, it seems to me. You know, the numbers that I threw up there in the very simplest framework you can think about gave a pretty strong effect, and they didn't account for any of the things that you mentioned. They didn't account for the DeLong and Summers hysteresis effects and any number of other things. And I think what's really stunning about this, in some respects, is that little calculation about how $1 of stimulus doesn't cost $1 of deficit. I mean, even if you think about that deficit as creating potentially some kinds of transfers you don't like, the that feedback effect is really quite stunning. You don't need really huge multipliers. I mean, a 1.8 number, 1.5 number, these are not numbers that are out of bounds. My guess is actually in the current situation the number is in fact higher, but that really does have a big effect on these calculations.
The lady in green, please.
I just want to raise a more general question on whether, this is addressed to all of you, whether you feel that there is a coming back in the profession to the acceptance that after all the Keynes multiplier is theoretically interesting, and how do you explain why it took so long for the profession to acknowledge that? We have seen that the return to Keynes in the last couple of years has concentrated on issues of uncertainty, the thing that we've been discussing the last couple of days, that this is the important thing. But of course, the Keynes idea about the multiplier has also an important role to play in this discussion. And all of you have shown us data, and they've tried to, to show that in the circumstances, this is indeed. But then also in Brad, in DeLong and Summers' paper, there is a reservation. The results are robust as far as the short period, yes, the situation is concerned, but maybe the multiplier in normal circumstances would not work. So it's one step forward and one step back again. So what is your sense of where the profession is really moving forward in making the multiplier, Keynes multiplier, again part of the conceptual tools of how we look at the economy, of just one step forward? Yes, because there is the debt overrun, yes, because there is the, but basically, we don't need that. Thank you.
I mean, being from Cambridge, even if for only 18 months, I guess I should answer this. No, that's Cambridge. I mean, it was a different one. That's fine. No, it's okay. But the point is, this question is actually, I read, maybe, let me say, I read a very deep question in what you're saying, which is, why we are coming back to the question is clearly because something has happened that reminds us. But the point is, the intellectual framework of Keynes at the point had this idea of insufficient demand in a totally different frame. And I'm not a theorist. I do a lot of theory of model, but I don't consider myself a theorist. I consider by question driven. And the question here is that insufficient demand might be our back companion for another 20 years. Every night we go to bed, and in the night light, there will be something that says, there are idle resources there, and we don't know why. Some people have in mind the leveraging, some people have in mind other stuff. But the point is, what has happened in 2007, 2008, which may have been brewing since the 90s, is that people are growing increasingly uncertain. You mentioned uncertainty. So for me, that consolidation, fixing the economy, macro, means dealing with this enormous increase in uncertainty, which made tail events that people had considered until 2008 impossible, a relevant issue to think about. My banking account, my pension, my health system, how do I pay the schooling of my children? So all this uncertainty, so when we think about fixing the economy, I think we think about dealing with this uncertainty. So in a way, I notice that I never say stimulus in my presentation because I'm talking about actually the cost of contraction. I don't see, frankly speaking, coming from Italy, that must be a little bit in my genes, there is not much space for, Rogoff in the sense is right, no? There is a lot of that there, and he's talking about deleveraging in a way, no? So there is an issue of deleveraging, there is an issue of uncertainty. So, what I put and I finish here, what I put on the slides, maybe I was too quick, The idea of a crisis in which the first reaction by the government was to take out the risk from the private sector by putting it in the balance sheet of the government. I think now we're in a stage in which the risk is swinging back. It is from the budget of the government that is sort of spilling over the private sector. And this is something that the profession has never completely understood. So this is actually my criticism of what I think is the nightmare here, is the fact that it's not a transfer. The cost of spending, you know, if there is no sovereign risk crisis, is a transfer. If there is sovereign risk crisis, there is a sense in which it's actually a real cost. Because, you know, you can think of jurisdiction. So why is that people in Italy pay so much? It's cut off. Why is they're in a credit crunch? You can think of situations like, you know, I'm subject to increase in tariffs. The local demand is low. I'm subject to tax increases. So there is a lot of things that make my life extremely more uncertain. And I'm becoming basically more risky as a firm, depending on the jurisdiction where I operate. So all this is a little bit the nightmare in which if you live in the UK, where I am now, this is actually the discussion every day at the grocery. Can we afford, no? Can we afford? So this, I think, it would be nice to understand how to deal with this uncertainty. So in that respect, we are back to Keynes in a much deeper way than simply the can 1 over 1 minus C. Okay. And I finished there. I bet any money here that 10 years from now, we're still going to bed with the, you know, insufficient aggregate demand problem. So I really hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong.
I have to make a comment. I'll be very brief in the following sense, which is, I'm at least as Keynesian as the fellow to my right, but I'm a little more optimistic. I'm not Keynesian. And I think the issue is my Italian genes are 2 generations removed. So as a result, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I've thought this would be a serious structural problem for a while, and I think it is, but 20 years sounds to me too pessimistic.
But then you go back to Brad DeLong that says that in that situation, that is not a big deal. So
Keith, you wanted to add something?
I just want to add, there's a presumption in that question that there is no way we can avoid Keynes anymore. And let me just try to push back on that a little bit. It's correct to say, for all the reasons that we talked about, that yes, fiscal stimulus and so on is going to help. But the way I think of this crisis is not to say that we must bring Keynes back into the policy discussions. To me, it tells us that there is a way that we avoid Keynes altogether, which is, why are all these problems associated with debt? I think that's the most fundamental question. Keynes only becomes relevant whenever we have a debt problem. That happened in Great Depression. That has happened everywhere. So the long run solution should be, we should avoid having to think of Keynes at all. And the solution is, the fundamental problem is with our financial system, which is, it is not appropriately sharing risk given an aggregate shock. That's the fundamental problem. And so there, I think that's where that's where I mentioned the non-contingent debt possibility. I think that's the deeper message that I take away from this, is to make Keynes irrelevant so we don't get into those liquidity traps and so on.
I think we're going to have to stop here. We can continue on, but Giancarlo has to get to the airport. The rest of us can stay here, but I've been told there's a car waiting for you. And thank you for a wonderful.
I completely agree.